All right, Psalms of Lament. I was telling Zoe and her mom Sherry as well that it's kind of be a negative day today because I had that sermon, then Psalms of Lament, and then we're doing church discipline and all, and so I appreciate your patience and bearing with me. But the Scripture's filled with these kinds of things, and I think that if we approach service to God with this mindset that everything is sunshine and rainbows, and we should always have a smile on our face, nothing should ever be so bad that we get down, then we're going to fail miserably. And I'm thankful to God that He would reveal to us Psalms and even a whole book of Lamentations like He did and address those difficult circumstances because we do go through them. And I think that's where we'll find some benefit to this lesson. So I know we know what lament is, but New Oxford American Dictionary defines it as a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. And so question 1, we'll start with that, asks, from a Christian perspective, what do you make of expressions of great lament to God as seen in the Psalms? Should a Christian lament in such a way? So who wants to answer that? Could be multiple people. You're in great need of help, and you're expressing that to God. So, certainly, if we're ever in need of help, we may be lamenting before God, right? Anyone have anything else on that?
Outwardly or inwardly?
Are you asking, or?
Is that us outwardly or inwardly?
Yeah.
Lamenting.
Right. Yeah, we might not cry it from the rooftops or something, but we certainly have those inward struggles, don't we? And God knows our heart, and we certainly cry out to Him in prayer in words that we might be able to think of, but then there are some times where things are so bad that our spirit groans, and because Jesus can sympathize with us, He can make intercession for us as well. I believe Romans 8 talks about that, but anyone else on that? Yes, ma'am.
I think it makes you feel better to express yourself to God. And
Sure.
Of course, sometimes in these he feels like he's not being heard, but
Yeah.
most of the time you see them coming to their senses and realizing that God is listening.
Yeah. And there might be a time component to that feeling as well, that, I'm crying out with such specific struggles and such emotion. God should have heard me by now, and there's that kind of thought as well, and it kind of adds to it as well. We'll talk about some songs like that. Oh, How Long, O Lord, right? Certainly. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking of the scripture that says we can cast all our cares upon Him, for He cares for us. I would never want to show disrespect for my God.
Right.
But I think we are. He is the all-powerful one that knows everything,
Yeah.
so we can go to Him. I'm kind of wouldn't want to use maybe some phrases
Sure.
because it would violate my conscience.
Yeah.
I still think I have to go to Him when you need.
Yes, ma'am. You don't want to, and I think that when we read some of these, and it's kind of jarring to us, the language that is used, I think the difference comes down to the sentiment of the heart behind it. Because there are some things, we can say something, and someone else can say that same thing, but we mean very completely different things. And so certainly we've got to be, if we're expressing this language, and He encourages us in the lesson to have more of a raw vulnerability before God, there's got to be a context understanding of it and our understanding of the nature of God as well. Did you have something?
Yeah, kind of along the same lines as Marie. We're going to be sharing our soul. We're giving every care to Him.
Yeah.
We're giving trust to Him that He's going to hear us. And eventually we will also, during that crying out, we're going to see the blessings that God has given us through that hard time.
Sure. That's a great point. She said that we're trusting Him with our innermost struggles and cries, things that He already knows. But then on top of that, as we go through it, we're going to see the blessings that He gives us through that. That's a great point. So certainly, these things written for our learning, we can implement them into our lives, and we should. That doesn't make this easy. It's a very foreign thing to us that we would pray to God like this. But David is, and other psalmists are, and that's communication from them to God. While it's certainly an inspiration and revelation, therefore, from God to us, it's certainly there for a reason to help us in our faith and how we would express ourselves to God, and he addresses that later on in the lesson. So here's what I want us to do is look at Lamentations 3 real quick. We won't spend a ton of time in there, but just notice something there. Because I think what it expresses there, and throughout these Psalms of Lament as well, is that this isn't just merely a complaint or even an expression of grief, but an expression of faith. And so I think we can understand that from the fundamental basis that if God already knows everything we're going through and every way we think about what we're going through, how we really feel, whether we say something to someone else, I'm fine, or it's not that big a deal, he knows how we truly feel. Coming to grips with that means I'm willing to be bare before him and lay that out before him. And you don't disclose the most intimate, deep secrets of your heart, of your life, of your mind to people that are distant from you. You do it to those who are closest to you. And that manifests, I think, a very close relationship with God, and it certainly will strengthen that relationship. And I think, as we'll see, it's an expression of faith. Lamentations is about the prophet witnessing the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians and lamenting for himself, but also for the nation. It's a very dark book. But in chapter 3, you see this glimpse of that hope that is there and connected with the concept of anguish and lament. In verse 18, he had said, my strength and my hope have perished from the Lord. So things are getting really bad. But then he says, remember my affliction and roaming. He says, my soul still remembers and sinks within me. And this I recall to mind, therefore I have hope. So he's calling God to remember all the bad things they're experiencing and how terrible it is for them. And what he's doing in that is casting his care upon God. And therefore, based on him just at the very beginning, telling God what God already knows, but telling God his innermost struggles, he has hope. He sees a ray of light in that. Then in verse 22, it elaborates on that. It says, though through the Lord's mercies we're not consumed, because his compassions fail not, they're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And so, while things are terrible, I also see the goodness of God today, this morning, and every day. If God was not good, if he was not merciful, if he was just completely separated, holy, and he did not care about his people, we would have been utterly consumed. There would have been none left. But throughout Scripture, we find a remnant, don't we? Then he says in verse 24, the Lord is my portion, therefore I hope in him. So if all I have is God, though I'm going through this terrible thing, that's enough. So then in verse 25, he waits on the Lord. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, the soul who seeks him. It's good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It's good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. And so he's finding good things in this. He's finding that it cultivates character, and that's why before you get to a really hard trial, it's good to have some trials in your youth to bear up under that weight. It's good to wait on God, not question him, but to have faith in him and maintain integrity before him in that regard. And in that, there's humility before the Lord, verses 28 and 29. He says, let him sit alone and keep silent, because God has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust, there may yet be hope. Verse 30, let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him and be full of reproach. And so God is allowing this, or in this case, God is punishing us for our evil. So let's own up to that. Let's embrace that. Let's submit to it fully and endure it. And then in verse 31, the Lord will not cast us off forever, though he causes grief. Yet he will show compassion according to the multitudes of his mercies. For he does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. So it's not going to last forever. God is hearing us. He will deliver us. And that kind of encapsulates our lesson, the Psalms of Lament. It's true, raw feelings and experiences expressed before God, who already knows, but in faith that God cares, that he wants us to be in intimate connection and communication with Him, and that in telling Him these things, though we already knows them, it will move Him, as we'll talk about later, to show His care and compassion on us and deliver us from these things. He mentions in the lesson that there are two types of these songs, personal and then, of course, communal. He says something interesting on page 45. The crises can be varied, sometimes spiritual, but at other times material, physical, or mental, or a combination. I would suggest to you that while there's that variety, that there's always something spiritual involved. Why might that be? How could, just without any kind of contextual connection, that my sickness or my loss was a direct result and consequence of my sin, and so it's just time and chance happens to them all, and I'm going through this physical affliction, how might that have any spiritual significance? It's always spiritual. Why? Say that again. We've got a soul. What we're doing with our bodies, how we're reacting, there's an eternal part of our being that is complicit in all of that. And so how do you react to this? Can the flesh, physical pain and anguish and sorrow affect our soul? Absolutely can. And that's what Satan's trying to do. He's trying to beat us down with it. But the wonderful thing is that God allows it to happen. He's actually trying to build us up. Paradoxically, He's allowing something to tear at us so that we can be built up. But that all has to do with the spiritual, doesn't it? And so in these Psalms of Lament, even when it may be obvious that it's a physical thing that he's going through, and he may not have brought it on himself, there are great spiritual implications to this. Remember in Psalm 73, we won't turn to that, but Psalm of Asaph, he almost stumbled. His foot almost slipped. And he's suffering, but when he was envious of the wicked, when he saw the prosperity of the ungodly. And so he's suffering, probably at their hand, and he's righteous, but if he's not careful, that physical affliction is going to tear his soul apart as well. And then in Psalm 102, he actually gives us this as an activity. Psalm 102, which seems to be one of community. We see in verse 13 that indication. But the superscription says, a prayer of the afflicted when he is overwhelmed and pours out his complaint before the Lord. I think he mentions in the psalm sometimes it's very obvious what the psalm deals with. Certainly there's physical trouble there. But in verse 2 he talks about his days of trouble. Don't hide your face from me in the day of trouble. Incline your ear to me. And then he details that trouble in verses 3 through 11 with some very interesting language that has been very familiar to us throughout the Psalms, especially recently studying Psalm 22 and the kind of imagery that is associated with that torment and that anguish and affliction. But then in verse 12, it says, you, O Lord, shall endure forever, in the remembrance of your name to all generations. And then notice in verses 16 and 17, the Lord shall build up Zion. So it's communal, but the Lord shall build up Zion. He shall appear in his glory. He shall regard the prayer of the destitute and shall not despise their prayer. What is the outcome to that? Verse 18. This will be written for the generation to come, that a people yet to be created may praise the Lord. When we have something happen to us physically, be it a loss or an illness with no seeming connection to some fault of our own, it will bear great spiritual implications, whether negatively or positively. And that's what he's saying there. There's always something spiritual involved, and that's not something I always appreciated. When people get sick, when they go through hardship in the body, and there's a reason why we weep with those who weep. There's a reason why that we have pain when others have pain. We empathize with them. And that's so crucial to the body of Christ, because if we're not careful, those people can be overwhelmed in that kind of grief and pain and anguish, and they can lose their soul, because Satan's good at what he does. Anyone want to add anything to that? All right, so certainly spiritual things throughout this. So he uses Psalm 13 to show the typical structure of a psalm of lament. And by the way, as you read in your book, Psalms of Lament are the primary content of the Psalms. It's everywhere. And so you can read through it all and find them very consistently. So we'll look at a few. But Psalm 13, only 6 verses. Can someone read Psalm 13?
How long, O Lord, will you forgive me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemy say, I have prevailed against him. Lest those who trouble me rejoice, for I am moved. But I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, because he dealt bountifully with me.
Thank you, Carl. So it really gives us kind of the typical psalm of lament. And he breaks it down in these parts. First, the invocation. And so we're invoking God. We're invoking his nature, perhaps, his character, his past that has expressed that kind of character. And we are calling upon him not just for help, but even though we know he knows all things, faith will make certain that he is called upon with that kind of specificity. And so that he does see everything. It's not a doubt that he does, but it's a practice of faith that he does, and being very clear with him. And there in verse 1, how long will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? And that's part of these struggles, as Lisa pointed out, with these Psalms of Lament. Sometimes it just seems like God's not hearing me, or God doesn't see it, because I've talked to him about this, I've prayed to him about this, and I'm still going through this. How long? And that's what the psalmist is expressing. In his commentary, Charles Spurgeon says, time flies with full-fledged wing in our summer days, but in our winters he flutters painfully. A week within prison walls is longer than a month at liberty. And that's certainly the case. But God may have a reason for that delay, doesn't he? And so when we say, how long, O Lord, that's not necessarily us being so agitated that we're doubting in him and that we're getting on to him, kind of, but it's just an honest perspective being expressed to him that this taking longer than I thought is really weighing on me, God, and I want you to know that. And that's what we see here. So calling upon God. He's not lost faith, but expressing his desire. What comes next after the invocation? The complaint or the lament. So what is it? What's going on? What's taking so long to be relieved? What's happening during this time? And what was it in verse 2? How long shall I what? Take counsel in my heart. So have you ever reflected on your difficulty and it's not going away? It's not being relieved. You don't know what to do. You've been thinking about what to do. You've been asking others what to do. You're not finding the answer to your problem. And you're asking God, I don't know what to do here. Why aren't you telling me? Why aren't you changing something? Why aren't you revealing something to me? And so sorrow's filling his heart. And he says, how long will my enemy be exalted over me? Well, I can't escape this by myself. And I don't feel like I'm getting anything from you. How long is it going to take? You ever felt that way? And so we know that certainly the way is not in ourselves. And so what does he do in the next section? He petitions. He asks God for help. He says, I'm not cutting it. So how long until you come in and you show me the way? And he speaks about in verse 3, God enlightening his eyes lest he sleep the sleep of death. Open my eyes that I may see, one psalmist says, the wondrous things in your law. I'm missing something. I don't see how this is working to your will. I don't see how this is working for my good. I don't see how I'm going to get out of this, how things are going to get better. Open my eyes to that, please. How long is it going to take? Open my eyes to that. And it's that persistency of faith that we're seeing. And so I know my ways aren't in myself to direct my own steps, that way is the way of death. Things aren't working. I'm not going to go away from you and try to do my own will that is unrighteousness. And you remember Paul in Ephesians 5 says, awake you who sleep, rise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. I want that light. I want that direction. So there's petition and supplication. And then what's the result of that? The last one. It's not in all the Psalms of Lament, but typically.
I'll trust you, I'll praise you.
There's a great shift, isn't there? From all of this struggle to now positivity. I'm going to trust you in spite of it. I'm going to trust you because you've answered me. And so maybe this is in the moment he's saying, like, I'm so confident based on my petition that I'm going to be joyful and singing to the Lord as you've dealt bountifully to me. Or maybe it's in reflection of what has happened and God has blessed him because he got through it, he endured. At any rate, it reflects what Isaiah reveals by inspiration in Isaiah 40:31. Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So you put side by side verse 6 and verse 1. How long, O Lord, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. It's not a question of our faith. We're not losing faith. But in petitioning God in that way, we're actually expressing a fuller, sincere faith that will actually see the fruit of God's goodness. Yes, ma'am.
Would 1 Peter 1 and 7, I don't know, that kind of speaks to me about our faith being purified like gold is purified. All the impurities have to be fired out of it. So our faith, we just don't have this full golden faith without some trial. And then how long? But we think on down to unto the praise and honor and glory at the appearing of our Lord Jesus. Then we have this calmness or this peace
Yes, ma'am.
after all this comes, after our faith has been tried.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that
Pretty well.
1 Peter chapter 1 is what she referred to, and so there is certainly, this is basically the application of that almost. It's like, here's the theory, and here's the actual activity. This is what it actually looks like. So theoretically, we live our lives by faith, that's going to be tested, and we're going to be purified through that test. And the fact that he uses fire burning away impurities and precious metals shows you how painful this can be. And so I think the Psalms of Lament, I love that parallel, that point. They express in more practical words and experiences what that might look like and how that journey might actually unfold. It's not just, I know this is a test from God and so it's going to be fine. It's a real struggle, and we're wrestling with those thoughts and those feelings, and we're struggling, and we're laying ourselves before God bare, and we're trusting that he's going to have compassion on that and that he's going to do it in his time. So we may ask how long, but at the end, if we have endured, then we realize, oh, okay, that's why, and now I'm better for it. And certainly the very end is the point, the salvation of our souls in heaven. That's a great parallel. That's essentially what this is, and I think that's why it's so important. We will be tested, and this is how you deal with it, especially the greatest trials. Yes, sir.
You know, it is very important, the point you made a little bit earlier about we weep when other people's weep. Because there's an example, we all know somebody that has lost, had a tragedy, some kind of tragedy, and gave up on God.
Yeah.
We were talking to some people that were associated with a school shooting. One got stronger, one became an atheist.
Yeah.
Because they lamented, but they didn't wait.
Yeah.
And they didn't, and more importantly, they didn't trust.
Right.
It's not that we lament once.
Sure.
Right. You lament over and over until God takes care of you.
Yeah.
And it's on God's time.
Yeah.
And we can't give up on God. People will come to you and say, well, they blame God for it instead of going to God for help with it.
Yeah, that's a great point. It brings out a contrast between when people suffer a tragic loss of a loved one, and it may destroy the faith altogether of one, and they become an atheist, and it may actually strengthen the faith of another, and both are lamenting. I think that's where Marie's point comes in, is that it's hard for us to comprehend a context where I would have the boldness to pray some of these things. But I think that there's a difference between one just complaining and one actually praying. The lamentations are coming up to God, and I'm trusting He's hearing, and I'm trusting that He cares, and that He's going to act just in His time. And then I wait, and I'm going to see it through, and it's going to be better. And the person who has lost their faith, they're probably never going to heal at all. But then this person, while they'll deal with that the rest of their life, is actually blessed by God in that circumstance. DJ and then Dar.
Yeah, also, we read all these Psalms, the answer is always God, and that's the solution, that's where they find their peace. But also, the writer of these Psalms, they held God in a certain place before this event, before this
Yes.
lament. There was that previous relationship, because I think when the world looks at this, they don't understand it, because they didn't have that with God before, and they're expecting Him to show up now. You know, I think that's where there's comfort in this, is we can relate as Christians to the writer of these Psalms.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, an important point. Basically, that we have to develop faith, or this isn't going to actually happen. We're going to respond in a very negative way, ungodly way. These people were men of faith, and that's why they could respond in the way that they did. And so it starts now. Every tiny trial is preparing you for the bigger trials. And so if you have a faith in these things, you're going to be able to express that in the bigger ones. Dara?
I too felt like Marie, when, you read some of the verbiage in it, and you're like,
Right.
It seemed to be strong, but it made me reflect back to Job, where Job lamented in the similar ways,
Yeah.
used some of the similar language, but yet God said he did not sin.
Definitely.
And, so knowing, kind of like that brings you to DJ's point of where they were and where that brings them to that conclusion.
Yeah.
That motivate, they were coming to that. I think Bruce Reeves did a sermon that took you step by step through
Sure.
our feelings when we go through things, and but it's got to have that conclusion
Definitely.
and that beginning,
Yeah.
to be the proper lamenting and returning to God.
Yeah, it's the whole picture. You can't just utter these words and then not follow them up with that steadfastness and confidence for God to answer you and alleviate that pain and help you through that. And that's what makes it an expression of faith. God, I'm going to be honest with you. This is how I'm feeling. I'm not turning my back on you. I'm actually asking for help. And when we think that He's not answering yet, you keep asking and you keep asking and you keep asking. And that's what makes it a matter of faith, certainly. So he talks about the nature of the complaint in these Psalms. And this is some more stuff that may be jarring to us. And we may wonder, whatever could he mean by this being a complaint against God? How could we complain about God in prayer and such? Look at back in Lamentations 3 again, very quickly. We read this verse, but in Lamentations 3 in verse 28, he says, "Let him sit alone and keep silent, because God has laid it on him." There specifically, they are being punished. But I'm reminded of Hebrews chapter 12, where these brethren are losing their faith. And you might remember in chapter 10 of Hebrews, he said, "Recall the former days when you were first illuminated, how you endured a great struggle with sufferings, that you had compassion on me and my chains." So they're faithful. And so you've got that affliction and that trial that happened very early on in their faith when they weren't questioning God. They weren't entertaining error and turning back to the old law. They were still suffering, though. And then chapter 12 says, "You have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, for whom the Lord loves he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives." And so it's not necessarily so that Hebrews is about a people that are going through great trials of affliction because they have sinned and God is punishing them. Though it may have gotten to that point, it was happening when they were faithful. And God had laid it on them, was the point of chapter 12. God is doing this because he loves you. He's allowing this to happen because he loves you. But it still is a struggle. So God, why did you forsake me to this? Psalm 22. We talked about that, didn't we? It's not that he wasn't in fellowship with God. It's not that Jesus, that God turned away from him completely because he was actually guilty of the sin of the world. But God did leave him to die. He delivered him to die. This was by the predetermined and foreknowledge of God that he died. And I'm reminded of Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. What was Paul's deal? When he asked 3 times for something to depart from him. You remember? Thorn in the flesh, right? And it says it was a messenger of Satan. Did you say abundance of revelations? I thought I heard that. So it was a messenger of Satan to buffet him. Maybe that's just my mind talking to me. It was a messenger of Satan, but also the reason it was given to Paul, he says, was lest by the abundance of revelations I become too arrogant and prideful. I be exalted above measure, is what he says. And so God, it's from God. And so when he's pleading, Lord, this is too much, let it depart from me, that's kind of a complaint against, why did you do this? Why is this happening? Can't you take it away? It's not a lack of faith. We need to understand that. It's not making God your doormat to trample on. It is an expression of faith and an understanding. And that's where I guess these kinds of prayers will come with spiritual maturity, because it's an understanding of how God works and why these things might be happening. But even when we don't know why, understanding that God's ways are higher than our ways, and he's going to be able to use it for good somehow, some way. And so we may complain, God, this is really hard. Why are you letting this happen to me? But I trust in you. And there's the difference, right? Yes, ma'am.
We trust in God to answer your prayer. We want our answers now so we can see them.
Yeah, certainly.
But the answer may not come till after we're dead. Just like Abraham knew that the promises were coming, but that didn't happen in his lifetime.
Right. Might not come to us, the answer, until we've already passed. Like Lazarus may have been asking the same questions, and when he died and he's comforted, now I know it prepared me to endure and endure and endure so that I can be comforted. That's a great point. So maybe against God, it may be against an enemy. There's injustice, there's sin, and I'm bearing the brunt of that. Or against self. And he mentioned Psalm 22 as an example of all three. Why have you forsaken me? Enemies are surrounding me and gaping at me with their mouths. And then in verse 6, I'm a worm and not a man. So you might see all three in a psalm at any given time. So then he has a section that compares crises to being in Sheol and brings up Psalm 88. And I want you to turn there. This is a psalm of lament. It's the Lament of Laments. It is dark through and through. You've really got to look for the light. It doesn't end with a positive note. It just kind of ends. Colin Delich in his commentary says that Psalm 88 is the darkest, gloomiest of all the plaintive psalms. It's true that the name God of my salvation, with which the praying one calls upon God and his praying itself, shows that the spark of faith within him is not utterly extinguished, and that's really important to see. But as to the rest, it's all one pouring forth of deep lament in the midst of severest conflict of temptation in the presence of death. The gloom of melancholy does not brighten up to become a hope. The psalm dies away in Job-like lamentation. And we might wonder, what value does a psalm like this have for us? Well, it's not going to be understood by itself. We take it all, but it certainly has value to it. And the point in the book is comparing crises to Sheol, to being in Sheol, which is the place of the dead, departed spirits, is what the word is used for in the Old Testament. Question number 3 says, what do you see as the most fundamental feeling in the psalmist's heart when he says, as in Psalm 88, that he feels as though he is in the realm of the dead or the pit? And how is his feeling similar to what the reality of hell will be? Yeah. God's not there. He feels that, doesn't he? In fact, he's getting so close to death, but he's a righteous person. Notice in verse 9, he says, I have called daily upon you, I've stretched out my hands to you. Will you work wonders for the dead? Will the dead arise and praise you? Shall your loving kindness be declared in the grave, and your faithfulness in the place of destruction? Shall your wonders be known in the dark, and your righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? I can't have the fellowship I long to have with you, and worshiping you in the sanctuary, and praising you among the people that love you. I can't do these things that I treasure so much when I'm dead. That's his point. And so, and death is an enemy, and in death there is a separation. And of course, we know the full story, like we read the rich man Lazarus, but that doesn't make us any less fond of death and the implications that come from this. We're going to be separated from all the things that we love about our relationship with God. And of course, while it ends in that same darkness, we know that that's not really true, but there is a great sense of lamentation in this because he's so close to God. He does not want to depart from this life, not because he wants to live it up on this world, but because he loves fellowship with God, expressed in the ways that he's patterned for us while we are in the body. Does that make sense? Anybody else have anything on question 3? Yes, sir.
Well, it's kind of derives off of it, but the thought of these lamentation psalms is, I don't know, it just shows like a priority.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you get in a situation where you feel like there's absolutely no hope, it shows the psalmist here first going to God.
Yeah.
It's not a last. And oftentimes, just like you were showing us the Dawkins quotes of the extreme, when you don't go to God first when there's a crisis, the things that you could do. You could do things out of a panic. You could do things that will cause you to go the other direction.
Right.
And if we take ourselves and our faith and we go to God first when we're in these terrible times or these situations of feeling, or we know a crisis is coming, Christ showed it in the garden with prayer, that you go to God first with these things.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, either you won't have an answer or at least it's subsided.
Yeah.
But you're going to them. So it's just a priority that you go to them.
Yeah.
And it does help you not to go the opposite direction.
That's a really great point. You make it a priority to go to God first. And let's think about that. If I suffer a tragic loss or something to my health and it just happened, and the first thing I do is to go to God, that's going to be the true unfiltered feelings that I'm experiencing. I'm not going to have time. If the first thing I do is go to God with that, I'm not going to have time to think through, well, I'll give it some time before I go to God. I don't want to go to Him in this kind of a spirit. But if I immediately go to Him, it's going to be like Psalm 88 a lot of times, because it's not been long enough to subside, and maybe that's what needs to happen for you to start seeing the light, is to let God know about the darkness you're experiencing. That's what Psalm 88 does. There's light in it, but you've got to think about it with a very spiritual mind. So when he says in verses 1 and 2, I cried out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. Someone says, well, you might as well stop. Give up. He's not answering you. But what this shows is a steadfast supplication before him. And then in verses 3 through 9, he explains in a lot of that language about Sheol and death, how he's in the pit and it's a struggle and it's really hard. But he's recognizing the control of God in this. Notice in verse 6, you have laid me in the lowest pit and darkness in the depths. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you have afflicted me with all your ways. In 2 Samuel 24, when David makes the ungodly and unlawful census, and he's going to be punished for it, Gad the prophet gives him an option to choose what his punishment will be, and he chooses the plague. And this is David's reasoning in 2 Samuel 24:14 to Gad. I am in great distress. Please let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. And the psalmist is recognizing this. At least I'm still in fellowship with you. At least you're in control. And then he's constant in that cry. Verse 9, it says, I have called daily upon you. And so while things haven't changed, I haven't changed in my cry to you. I've been persistent in my faith. And then when things don't go away, verses 13 through 18, my resolve is to continue to cry out to you, O Lord, and in the morning my prayer comes before you. So if I'm going to go through it and keep going through it, I'm going to go through it with God. I'm not going to abandon him because I know he's not abandoned me. So there's great things to receive from that. We don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this, but he mentions that a lot of times these Psalms of Lament have to do with prayers of sick persons. And like I mentioned before, and he alludes to it here, that oftentimes physical affliction, or all times physical affliction, have spiritual implications to it and stuff. But also we see in Scripture, and he says it here, sometimes we're not always given the direct reason, but sometimes we did bring it on ourselves, whether directly or indirectly. And he says the very process of constructing a song of lament may help identify the true cause of our suffering and impel us toward confession. You remember in James 5 verses 13 through 16, where he's talking about prayer, and the prayer of faith will save the sick, and if he has committed any sins, the Lord will forgive him. It may be that God is bringing punishment upon us for the things that we've done, and maybe that might wake us up. Sometimes it has to do with the false accusations. We looked at Psalm 7 in the Psalms of David. Maybe pleas for asylum in God's temple or sanctuary, or prayers of the oppressed or persecuted, and then general laments. And hopefully you studied Psalm 74 and got some good out of that, because that was an example of a communal psalm. I appreciate your kind attention, and we'll be picking up with Lesson 12, Lord willing, on Wednesday.